The inner child is not merely a psychological metaphor, nor a sentimental recollection of one's early years. It is an archetype, a living symbol of the original self. Deep within the layers of the psyche, beneath the cultivated persona and the defensive ego structures, there resides an unbroken essence that has never been touched by the world's conditioning. This essence is not naive, but pure, not ignorant, but whole in its own mysterious way. It is the part of us that once knew life without fragmentation, before fear wrapped itself around instinct, before shame eclipsed joy, before the soul was taught to mistrust its own voice. In the symbolic architecture of the psyche, the inner child represents the totality of our undeveloped potential, as well as the memory of a time when existence was still experienced in unity rather than opposition. To speak of the inner child as an archetype is to recognize that it does not belong to the historical past alone. It is not simply who we were, but who we are in essence. Buried under the weight of social adaptation and psychic compromise, it appears in dreams, often as a wounded figure, lost or abandoned, sometimes radiant and godlike, calling us back to something that cannot be manufactured by will or intellect. This figure emerges not to remind us of what was, but to lead us into what must be etted, if the personality is ever to be whole. The child within is paradoxical. It is the most fragile and yet the most enduring, the most vulnerable and yet the most inviolable. It is both the original wound and the original wholeness. One cannot understand the inner child through direct observation or conscious recollection alone. Its logic is symbolic. It speaks the language of images, feelings, and subtle energies. Often it reveals itself through the spontaneous tears that rise during moments of tenderness, through the paralyzing fear that feels disproportionate to the situation, through the deep longing for unconditional love, or the unexplainable melancholy that arises in the midst of success. It lives within the body, encoded in posture and tone, in the flinch that precedes touch, in the joy that erupts unbidden when we encounter something beautiful. The adult mind, structured by time and categories, tends to overlook or dismiss these signals. But the inner child does not forget. It waits, sometimes silently, sometimes through symptoms, but always faithfully. The formation of this archetype is not without tragedy. In the natural unfolding of childhood, the self is met with the inevitable friction of reality. Some wounds are small and manageable, others are profound and shattering. The child adapts by splitting off the parts of itself that seem unacceptable to others: anger, exuberance, neediness, spontaneity. In doing so, it creates a psychic architecture that allows it to survive, but at the cost of internal coherence. The persona is strengthened, the shadow grows deeper, but the inner child remains untouched in a strange and sacred place within the psyche. It carries the memory of who we were before the fracture, and in that memory lies the seed of restoration. To relate to the inner child is to begin a conversation with the parts of ourselves that have been left behind. This cannot be done through analysis alone. The inner child does not respond to judgment or correction. It does not unfold under the scrutiny of intellect. It is a being of feeling and intuition, responding only to authenticity and safety. To heal the inner child is not to return to childhood, but to create within the adult psyche a space where the child can exist without fear. This is not regression, but reintegration. It is not sentimentality, but a sacred task. For as long as the child remains exiled, the adult remains incomplete. The inner child is not merely a personal experience, but a collective reality. Every human being carries within them this archetype, though its form and voice may differ. Across cultures and epochs, we find myths and stories that speak to this elemental truth: the divine child, the orphaned prince, the lost boy, the hidden daughter. These are not merely tales, but psychic maps. They point to the universal experience of being born into a world that cannot receive us in our wholeness, and the lifelong journey to reclaim that lost birthright. What is suppressed does not disappear. It is preserved, often in the unconscious, as a source of both suffering and potential. The inner child waits not to be remembered, but to be reclaimed. Many of the problems that afflict the adult personality, chronic anxiety, low self-worth, inability to love, compulsive perfectionism, emotional numbness, are the expressions of a child's voice that was never heard. These are not merely symptoms to be eliminated, but messages to be understood. Beneath every self-destructive pattern is a core wound that originated not in adulthood, but in early life, often long before language was available to name it. To bypass this wound is to bypass the very center of one's being, and yet the world encourages this bypassing. It rewards control over vulnerability, performance over presence, image over substance. The inner child becomes the casualty of this cultural forgetting, but it does not die. It finds other ways to speak. Dreams, for instance, are one of the clearest pathways through which the inner child communicates. The child may appear as an actual figure, or may be symbolized through animals, objects, or places. From childhood, it may call for attention through nightmares, through moments of regression, or through overwhelming emotional responses that seem to arise from nowhere. These are not pathologies, but invitations. The unconscious does not speak in straight lines. It whispers through metaphor, through dissonance, through longing, and if one listens carefully, one begins to hear not only pain, but the faint echo of joy, of imagination, of wonder, the lost inheritance of the soul. Healing the inner child requires a different mode of consciousness, one that moves away from mastery and toward reverence. The child does not need to be instructed. It needs to be seen. It needs to be told that its pain makes sense, that its confusion was never irrational, that its fear was a sane response to an insane world. When this happens, something extraordinary occurs. The adult self begins to soften, the rigid defenses begin to melt, and in this melting, a new kind of strength is born. Not the strength of control, but the strength of integration. One is no longer ruled by the child, nor alienated from it, but in relationship with it. The healing is not linear. There are moments when the inner child will resist contact, having learned through repetition that openness leads to hurt. There may be anger, shame, distrust. These must not be suppressed or explained away, but honored as protective responses. The child withdrew for a reason. It armored itself for survival. To reach it requires patience, gentleness, and the willingness to sit in silence. It requires the adult self to become a container, a vessel strong enough to hold vulnerability without judgment. This is no small task. It is perhaps the most profound spiritual discipline there is, to become the parent we never had, not only for others but for ourselves. To reconnect with the inner child is not to indulge in sentiment, but to make contact with the most vital parts of our humanity. It is to reclaim the capacity for wonder, for play, for authentic emotion. It is to restore the link between intuition and intellect, between spontaneity and responsibility. The child carries within it the seed of the future, as well as the memory of the past. When it is silenced, the psyche becomes dry, mechanical, repetitive. When it is listened to, the psyche becomes fertile again, capable of transformation. Art, love, imagination, all these spring from the well, where the child still lives, and so long as that well is poisoned or buried, we remain cut off from the deepest waters of the soul. This is why healing the inner child is not a luxury, but a necessity. It is not peripheral to psychological development, but central. Without this healing, maturity becomes a mask rather than a truth. One performs adulthood without ever inhabiting it. The voice may grow deeper, the responsibilities heavier, but the inner architecture remains incomplete. The child, unhealed, becomes a saboteur, acting out through relationships, through avoidance, through the quiet despair that never fully lifts. But when the child is acknowledged, when it is spoken to with tenderness and truth, it becomes an ally. It lends the adult its creativity, its resilience, its deep-rooted sense of connection to life. It does not dissolve into the background, but takes its rightful place in the constellation of the psyche. The task, then, is not to destroy the child within, but to welcome it. Not to fix it as one would fix a broken object, but to engage with it as one engages with something sacred. There is no final point of arrival in this process. The child may need to be spoken to again and again, especially in moments of stress or loss. The wound may reopen, the fear may return, but this is not failure. It is the nature of the psyche to move in spirals, not straight lines. What matters is that the conversation continues, that the adult self does not turn away in frustration or dismissal. For every time we turn toward the child with openness, something shifts. A thread is rewoven, a fracture begins to knit, and the self becomes, if only slightly, more whole. Words, as they are commonly understood, are seen as mere vehicles of information, tools used to express, describe, or command. But to the psyche, words are far more than instruments of utility. They are living symbols. They are not dead sounds, nor abstract signs, but carriers of psychic energy. When spoken from the heart or received in the vulnerable interior of the soul, even the simplest word can become a force of transformation. Language, in this deeper sense, is not constructed only by thought, but shaped by the soul's need to reveal itself and to be met. Words are not passive reflections of the mind, but active participants in the drama of human experience. They carry with them emotion, memory, unconscious associations, archetypal images, and the residues of all the mouths that have ever spoken them. Each word has a history that goes beyond etymology. A word like sorry does not merely express regret. It carries the weight of centuries of brokenness, of humility, of recognition. A word like love cannot be defined once and for all, because its meaning shifts with each speaker, each listener, each context. It can soothe or wound, invite or betray, heal or manipulate. This is because words touch not only the conscious mind, but the unconscious layers beneath, where symbols live. A symbol is not something that merely represents. It is something that presents, something that brings forth from the unconscious a reality that otherwise remains hidden. In this way, words, when charged with emotion and sincerity, become portals. They connect the outer world of speech with the inner world of experience. They bridge the visible and the invisible. When we speak to the inner child, or when someone speaks to our own, the words chosen must resonate with this symbolic quality. It is not enough to say something that is correct. The psyche does not respond to correctness. It responds to resonance. The inner child, being a symbol of original wholeness and unfiltered perception, hears words differently than the adult ego. It does not interpret with reason, it absorbs with feeling. A harsh tone can make a gentle phrase cruel. A warm tone can make a simple phrase medicinal. This is why words spoken to the inner child must come not just from the tongue but from the heart. They must be animated by presence, by care, by the willingness to dwell in the emotional reality of the moment. In many therapeutic encounters, breakthroughs do not occur because of a brilliant interpretation or a logical insight. They occur because the client hears something they have never heard before. You did nothing wrong. You are not alone. I believe you. You are just a child. These are not complicated phrases. They are not academically sophisticated. But they strike the soul with the force of revelation, because they name what had never been named. In the naming, the psyche relaxes. The tension that once held the wound in place begins to loosen. The child, hidden behind years of silence, begins to stir. A forgotten emotion rises. Tears come. These are not words. These are keys. They unlock doors within the unconscious that were sealed long ago out of necessity. The inner child is often frozen in a state of speechlessness. In early wounding, especially trauma that occurs before language is fully developed, the pain remains preverbal. The child could not speak it then, and so the adult carries it wordlessly. It shows up as anxiety, as emotional reactivity, as shame that has no source. Because there were no words given at the time of injury, healing requires the return of language, not as explanation but as presence. A simple phrase delivered with authenticity can give shape to an experience that had remained formless. It allows what was once unspeakable to be spoken, and in that speaking, the psyche begins to reclaim what it had to abandon. The words do not erase the pain, but they give it context. They affirm its reality. They make it bearable. To understand words as living symbols is also to understand that silence itself can be a word. A pause at the right moment, a deep breath, a space in which emotion can rise without interruption. These are as vital to communication as speech. The unconscious does not operate on the same timeline as the conscious mind. It unfolds slowly, cyclically, organically. It needs room to emerge. When we speak too quickly, when we fill the space with advice or analysis, we may be using words, but we are not communicating. Communication with the inner child requires stillness, softness, and an awareness of the sacred. For every phrase that touches the soul, there are hundreds that bypass it. The words that matter most are rarely the most eloquent. They are the most true, not true in logic, but true in feeling. One must also recognize that not all words are equal in power. Some words, when heard in childhood, became weapons. "What's wrong with you? You're too sensitive. You're imagining things." These phrases, repeated in formative years, become internalized voices. The inner child carries them as if they were facts, not opinions. They form the foundation of self-image, shaping how one relates to others, to oneself, and to life itself. Part of the healing journey is to introduce new words, words that displace the old voices with something kinder, more human, more accepting. It is not enough to tell oneself, "I'm good," if the unconscious still holds the belief that one is bad. The new words must be repeated, must be lived, must be felt over and over again, until they begin to resonate more strongly than the inherited ones. This takes time, it takes gentleness, it takes ritual. Ritual is an important aspect of healing through words. To speak a healing phrase once may begin the process, but to speak it often, in moments of quiet, with the intention of listening deeply, transforms it into a living mantra. A mantra is not magic because of its syllables. It is magic because of its relationship to meaning. When a person looks in the mirror and says, not as an affirmation but as a sacred truth, "You are safe now," the phrase becomes more than sound. It becomes an invocation. The inner child, hearing it again and again, begins to believe that perhaps it is true. The nervous system relaxes. The heart opens. Something shifts beneath the surface of ordinary awareness. This is the power of symbolic language. It reorders the inner world without force. The unconscious is filled with memories that have no words attached. Emotional memories, bodily memories, psychic imprints. These live beneath the level of story. They influence behavior without revealing their origins. When these memories are met with symbolic words, it is as if they are being seen for the first time. "I'm here with you," when said in the presence of inner distress, has the capacity to reach into these mute places and bring them into awareness. Awareness is not the same as explanation. One does not need to know exactly what happened in the past in order to heal it. One needs to feel that what happened is now being held differently. Words create the container for this holding. They give the soul a place to rest. There is also a sacred reciprocity in speaking and hearing healing words. Just as the inner child longs to be spoken to with compassion, it also longs to speak. But many adults do not know how to listen. They dismiss their emotions, intellectualize their pain, or deny the validity of their needs. The inner child becomes further exiled in this environment. But when one begins to listen, not with the aim of fixing, but with the willingness to understand, a dialogue opens. The child within may begin to whisper, "I'm scared. I feel alone. Please don't leave me." These are not melodramatic statements, they are truths. And to answer them, not with criticism but with presence, is to create a new relational pattern within the psyche. "I hear you. I'm not going anywhere. You matter to me." These phrases, when spoken inwardly, restore dignity to the parts of us that were once silenced. Words are also carriers of memory. The inner child often clings to specific phrases, both painful and comforting. A child who was once told, "You'll never be enough," may hear that voice echo into adulthood, shaping choices, limiting joy, creating an invisible ceiling. But a new phrase, introduced with sincerity and repeated with care, can slowly overwrite the old recording. "You are already enough," said not as a performance but as a truth felt in the body, can begin to take root. The key lies not in novelty, but in depth. The inner child does not need new words every day. It needs real words, spoken consistently, with love. Over time, these words become a new internal dialogue, a healing chorus that replaces the inner critic with the voice of a compassionate witness. The idea that words heal is not poetic exaggeration. It is psychic reality. The body responds to language. The nervous system calms in the presence of soft tones. The heart opens when met with warmth. The brain itself rewires in response to loving speech, but more profoundly, the soul reawakens when it is addressed as something sacred. Too often the modern world treats language as transactional, but to the inner world, language is relational. It is not the correctness of what is said that heals. It is the love embedded in how it is said. A word that carries feeling is a word that carries power. One must approach this work not as a technique, but as a devotion. To speak healing words to the inner child is to make an offering, to say, I see you, I value you, you are real. These are the affirmations that the child never received, the blessings that were withheld. By giving them now, one does not erase the past, but one alters the present. And the present in its symbolic depth is always pregnant with the possibility of transformation. Time in the unconscious is not linear. What was not given then can still be given now. The past may be fixed in memory, but it is fluid in meaning, and meaning is what language shapes. When a person speaks to themselves with kindness, with reverence, with patience, they are not indulging in fantasy. They are practicing soul care. They are repairing the inner temple where the child still lives. This temple is built not of stone, but of words, soft, simple, sincere, and each word, chosen with care, becomes a brick in the foundation of a new self, not a false self, constructed to please the world, but a true self that welcomes the child back home. This is the sacred potential of language, to call the lost ones back, to name the unnamed, to turn silence into song. Words, when they come from the depths, do not merely describe the soul, they awaken it. To speak a word that heals is not only an act of empathy, but a profound demonstration of presence. The presence behind the word is its lifeblood, its essence, its power to reach beyond the intellect and touch the emotional substratum of the soul. One can say, I love you, or you're safe now, but unless these words are spoken from a place of deep emotional congruence, the unconscious will register them as hollow, performative, or even threatening. The inner child, who dwells in the realms of feeling and intuitive perception, does not understand the language of performance. It listens beneath the surface, attending to the tone, the intention, the emotional truth embedded in the words. This is why words that are emotionally congruent, those that align with the heart of the speaker, are the only ones that penetrate the inner sanctum of the wounded child. Emotional congruence cannot be faked. The psyche recognizes falseness as surely as the body recognizes poison. The wound in the inner child is not merely a wound of words, but a wound of betrayal. Betrayal by those who were supposed to protect, understand, attune. Therefore, any attempt at healing must come with the opposite quality: attunement, sincerity, trustworthiness. When a person speaks to their inner child or to another's, they must become quiet enough inside to mean what they say. To say, I'm here for you, while internally distracted or emotionally unavailable, will only mirror the original abandonment. The inner child needs to feel the presence behind the words. That feeling is carried not by logic, but by emotional resonance. It is carried in the eyes, in the voice, in the breath, in the willingness to be still. Words that heal are not plucked from scripts. They arise spontaneously from the presence of the one who speaks them. This spontaneity is not chaotic, but organic. It emerges from the moment, as the speaker attunes themselves to the energy of the inner child. The child may not be visible, but it is perceptible, felt in the body, sensed in the breath. To reach the child with words, one must first enter the emotional landscape where the child still waits. That landscape is not cerebral. It is filled with sensation, tightness, longing, trembling, sadness, hope. These are not distractions from the work. They are the work. To speak from emotional congruence, one must descend into these sensations and allow them to shape the voice. Only then can the words carry truth. This truth is not factual accuracy, but emotional integrity. It is not enough to say something that sounds right. It must feel right. The unconscious does not respond to the literal. It responds to the symbolic, the emotional, the real. A therapist may have perfect language. A poet may craft perfect verses. But if the words are not inhabited with presence, they fall flat in the psyche. It is better to say, I see you, with trembling sincerity, than to deliver a monologue of ideal phrases that carry no emotional weight. The inner child recognizes love, not by the perfection of the words, but by the quality of attention. This attention is not casual. It is sacred. To turn one's full attention toward the child within, to speak to them with tenderness, is to undo years of internal neglect. Presence is the medicine that makes the word effective. It is not enough to recall comforting phrases or memorized mantras. One must embody them. When a person says "you're not alone" to their own inner pain, that phrase must be supported by a real willingness to stay with the fear, with the memory, with the grief that rises. The presence behind those words is what creates safety. The words alone do not heal. It is the loving awareness that animates them. In the absence of presence, words become another form of abandonment. But in the presence of presence, even a single word can open the heart, release the tear, soften the defended psyche. This is why silence is so often necessary before the healing word emerges. The silence is not empty. It is listening. It is a descent inward, a softening of the mind's need to fix or explain. It is the moment when one says, without words, "I'm here." In that silence something shifts. The inner child senses the difference. There is no rush, no demand, no denial, only a presence that makes room for the child to exist. From this space the right word may come, not the rehearsed word, but the needed one, the one that has weight, the one that carries care. Such words cannot be scheduled. They arrive when the conditions are right, when the speaker has become truly present. Emotional congruence also requires the speaker to be honest about what they feel. If there is uncertainty, let it be named. If there is tenderness, let it be shown. To pretend calm when one is afraid, or to pretend strength when one is overwhelmed, only teaches the inner child that feelings must be hidden. But when a person speaks honestly, saying, "I don't have all the answers, but I'm here," or "I feel this with you," they offer something rare. Truth without threat. The child does not need perfection. It needs connection. Emotional congruence is connection made audible. It says, "I'm with you in this," and the words become a thread binding the wounded part to the whole. In the early wounds of childhood, what was most often missing was not language, but attunement. A parent may have said, "I love you," but if their behavior contradicted the statement, if they were cold, distracted, volatile, the child internalized the contradiction. Words became unreliable. They no longer meant what they said. This is how the psyche fragments. It learns to distrust the surface, to seek safety not in words but in withdrawal. To reverse this pattern, one must reintroduce language that is trustworthy, not just by repetition, but by congruence. When the inner adult says, "You're safe now," they must also demonstrate that safety by staying with the emotion, by welcoming the tears, by not rushing the process. The healing word is not just said, it is lived. This presence must be sustained. A single moment of congruent speech may open the door, but sustained presence is what builds trust. The inner child, once betrayed, does not immediately return. It watches, it tests, it waits, and rightly so. It has learned through pain that words can lie. Therefore, the task of the conscious self is to continue speaking, to continue showing up, not perfectly but consistently, to say, again and again, "I'm with you," and to mean it. Each time this phrase is spoken with presence, a new layer of trust is formed. Eventually the child begins to believe, not because the words are clever, but because the presence is real. There is a tone of voice that conveys congruence more than any particular phrase. It is a tone that is soft, grounded, unhurried. It does not try to persuade. It does not mand. It does not hide behind formality or distance. It is the tone of a person who is willing to be changed by what they are witnessing. This tone reaches the inner child more deeply than any lecture or analysis. It says, "I will not leave, even if this hurts." Such tone cannot be taught in books. It is cultivated in the heart, in the willingness to feel. The one who speaks must first become vulnerable, then, and only then, can their words become vessels of healing. Presence is also revealed in breath. A shallow, hurried breath signals tension, anxiety, distance. A deep, slow breath signals safety. The child within listens to breath as much as to voice. A person who speaks to their inner child must learn to breathe with them, to inhale and exhale in a rhythm that says, "We are okay." This breathing becomes part of the language. It is a language without syllables but filled with meaning. In the presence of such breath, the child relaxes. Then the words, when they come, are received not as commands but as invitations. One must also speak, not only to the inner child, but with them. This requires a dialogue, not a monologue. Emotional congruence means allowing the child to speak back, to express their truth, their fear, their memory. The adult self must be prepared not only to offer comforting words, but to receive painful ones. The child may say, "You weren't there," or "I don't trust you." These are not accusations, they are confessions. They are signs that the child is beginning to open. To respond to such words with defensiveness would be to repeat the original injury, but to respond with presence, with "I hear you," "That makes sense," "I'm sorry," is to deepen the trust. Emotional congruence means holding space for the whole truth, not just the parts that are easy to hear. In this way, presence is not passive, it is active receptivity. It is the discipline of staying with what is uncomfortable without turning away. Words spoken from this place carry an extraordinary power. They are not weapons or tools, they are gifts. They are given freely, without agenda, and because they are given with emotional truth, they heal. They do not overwrite the child's story, they add to it. They bring in new characters, ones who stay, who listen, who care. Over time, as the inner dialogue becomes more congruent, the split within the psyche begins to heal. The adult self and the inner child begin to trust each other. The child no longer hides, and the adult no longer dominates. They become allies. This alliance is mediated by language. Language that is real, felt, slow and true. It is not fancy or sophisticated. It is humble. It says again and again, "You matter. I see you. I will not leave." These phrases, repeated with presence, become the new inner voice. They replace the critical parent, the absent caretaker, the shaming authority. They become the voice of the inner healer. Presence cannot be measured, but it can be felt. It is the invisible force that gives words their shape. Without presence, even the most beautiful sentence is empty. With presence, even a single word becomes a doorway. It is through this doorway that the inner child begins to emerge, not as a memory or a concept, but as a living, breathing part of the psyche. And it is through this emergence that true healing begins, not through analysis, not through explanation, but through connection. Emotional congruence is the bridge that makes this connection possible. It is not a technique, it is a way of being, and in this being, the word becomes sacred again. To understand the role of repetition in healing the inner child, one must first recognize the way in which the original wounds were formed. The inner child, that ancient remnant of our early psychic structure, did not come to its pain through a single isolated event. The formation of the child's distress was gradual, occurring through the repeated absence of comfort, the repeated dismissal of emotion, the repeated unpredictability of affection, or the repeated invalidation of personal truth. Just as a river carves the canyon through continuous flow, so too does psychic injury form through recurrence. A parent may have only occasionally yelled, but if they regularly failed to notice the child's fear, a deeper wound was etched. The repetition of being unseen, unheard, misunderstood, this is what erodes the child's trust in the world and, more devastatingly, in themselves. Thus, it follows that healing must also occur in repetition. The psyche does not trust words that come once and vanish. It has learned to expect inconsistency, and so it approaches even kindness with caution. The first time one says to the inner child, "You are safe now," the psyche may reject it, may doubt it, may quietly brace itself for abandonment. But if that same phrase is offered again and again with the same tone of tenderness and congruence, something begins to shift. The wall of mistrust, built over years, begins to crack, not through force, but through the gentle persistence of love. Repetition is not a trick or technique. It is the natural rhythm through which the inner world relearns safety. There is something sacred in the steady return of the same word, the same gesture, the same message of care. This return becomes a ritual, and the ritual becomes an anchor for the child who once experienced the chaos of unmet needs. Ritual is a balm, the repetition of affirming phrases. Phrases like "I'm here," "You matter," "I see you," offers not only content but structure, and structure, when delivered with warmth, becomes sanctuary. The words themselves are not magic, but through repetition they acquire symbolic power. They become part of the psychic fabric, stitched slowly into the narrative of the self. The repetition does not numb, it deepens. Each time the phrase is spoken, it penetrates a little more, finding new crevices in the soul where pain once hid, and planting seeds of belonging. In childhood, the absence of consistent mirroring leaves behind a fragmented image of the self. The child learns to see themselves through distorted reflections, reflections that say, "You are too much," or "You are not enough," or "You are only loved when." These internalized messages become the unconscious script by which the adult operates. To undo such scripts requires more than insight. It requires counterscripts, and these counterscripts must be repeated until they are no longer visitors but residents. Healing words must be spoken with the same regularity as the wound was formed. Where once the child heard shame, now they must hear acceptance. Where once they were ignored, now they must be greeted, again and again. There is a misconception that healing occurs in great revelations or dramatic breakthroughs. While such moments may come, they are rare and fleeting. The true work of healing is subtle, patient, rhythmic. It occurs in the daily choice to return to the child, to speak again the words that affirm their worth, to offer again the presence that was once missing. This daily return is not monotonous. It is devotion. Each time one returns with the same loving words, one reclaims a piece of the self that was exiled. One tells the inner child, not with ideology but with action, that they are no longer alone. And this repetition must not be mechanical. It must be embodied, lived, felt. The same phrase said with boredom or detachment becomes a mockery of care. But when said with sincerity, repetition becomes the voice of the new parent within. The parent who stays, who listens, who shows up again and again. The child within is not soothed by novelty but by consistency. It is not the brilliance of the words that matters but the reliability of their presence. Repetition becomes a promise. I will keep saying this, no matter how long it takes for you to believe it. This practice also serves to retrain the nervous system. The wounded child does not only live in memory but in the body. Their fear, their grief, their vigilance, these are encoded in muscle, breath, posture. When healing words are spoken regularly, and when they are accompanied by calm breath and grounded presence, the body begins to soften. The nervous system begins to unlearn its patterns of alarm. It begins to associate the healing phrase with safety. Over time, the repetition of gentle words becomes not just a psychological intervention, but a physiological recalibration. The heart beats differently. The breath slows. The entire being begins to orient toward peace. This is why healing words must be short, simple and repeated often. Complexity is for the adult intellect, but the inner child needs clarity. Just as a lullaby does not change its melody each night, the healing phrase must remain familiar. Its power lies in its constancy. It becomes an echo in the psyche, and the more it echoes, the deeper it goes. One might worry that the phrase will lose meaning if repeated too often, but the opposite is true. Each repetition gives the phrase more roots. It begins to grow a life of its own within the psyche, to bloom in places where only thorns once grew. And the timing of these words matters. They must be offered not only in moments of calm, but especially in moments of pain. When the old fear arises, when shame tightens its grip, when the nervous system begins to spiral, this is when the healing phrase must be returned. To speak it in that moment is to say to the child, "Even now you are worthy." The repetition in crisis is what makes the words real. It shows that they are not conditional, not dependent on performance or mood. They are constants, like the sun that rises every morning regardless of the night before. In this way, repetition builds trust, not just in the words but in the self. There is also a cumulative effect. At first, the healing phrase may feel foreign. The inner child may recoil, disbelieve, push it away. This is not resistance. It is memory. The child remembers being hurt by promises, but repetition wears down resistance not through force, but through love. Eventually the phrase is no longer just something one says. It becomes something one knows. The knowledge is not intellectual, but somatic, emotional, soulful. One begins to feel the truth of the phrase, and in that feeling a new foundation is laid, a foundation where once there was only rubble. This process also has a symbolic function. In archetypal terms, the repeated healing word is the voice of the inner wise one, the benevolent archetype that the child always longed for. Whether one calls this the inner parent, the soul, the higher self, or the divine makes no difference. What matters is that the child hears it often enough to begin to trust that such a voice is real. The repetition invokes this archetype into the psychic landscape. It fills the void left by the absent or distorted parental figure, and once this new voice is established, it becomes the axis around which the self can revolve. It becomes the stable center that allows integration to occur. Repetition also challenges the internal critic. The critic, too, speaks in repetition. You're not good enough. You always mess things up. No one will love you. These phrases, often inherited from caregivers, become the dominant voice within, but they are not the only voice. When the healing phrase is introduced and repeated, it begins to interrupt the critic's monologue. At first it may seem like a whisper against a scream, but with time and consistency, the healing voice grows louder, more confident. It becomes the new authority, and eventually it drowns out the critic, not by silencing it violently, but by offering a kinder truth. It is essential to understand that repetition is not about indoctrination. It is about reparenting. The child does not need to be convinced. They need to be accompanied. Each repetition is a hand extended, a light left on, a door kept open. It says, I will keep saying this, because I want you to know it deep in your bones. The child begins to internalize not just the message, but the reliability of the one who brings it. They begin to see the adult self as trustworthy. And in doing so, the split between the adult and the child begins to mend. There is no final time one says the healing phrase. There is no finish line. This is not a task to complete, but a relationship to maintain. The inner child does not outgrow the need for kindness. Even in adulthood, especially in adulthood, one benefits from returning to the same simple words. When life becomes overwhelming, when new wounds reopen old ones, these phrases become touchstones. They remind the psyche of what it has learned, of the safety it has cultivated, of the love it has grown. Repetition becomes remembrance. In moments of despair, when nothing seems to reach the pain, it is often the well-worn phrase that finds its way through. It is familiar, trusted, soaked with meaning. It is like a favorite song, a childhood blanket, a scent that brings comfort. The psyche does not forget it, because it has been imprinted through repetition. This imprinting is not regression, it is integration. It is the return of lost parts to the whole. Repetition is an act of faith. To say the same loving word again and again is to believe in the possibility of healing, even when it feels distant. It is to cast a vote, each day, for love over fear, presence over abandonment, connection over exile. And in this faithful return, the inner child begins to return too, not just as a wounded part, but as a source of joy, creativity, vitality. Repetition is the rhythm of love, and love, when practiced with patience, becomes the greatest healer of all. The journey of healing the inner child is not a grand spectacle, but a quiet unfolding, a sacred return to what was once forgotten or feared within us. It is not achieved by intellect alone, but by presence, patience, and profound self-compassion. In learning to say 7 simple words gently, honestly, and repeatedly, we offer the child within us what they needed all along: to be seen, to be held, to be spoken to with kindness. Through emotional attunement, through the embracing of symbolic language, through the ritual of repetition, and through the unwavering gentleness of tone, we slowly restore trust where it was broken. Each word becomes a light in the dark, each repetition a new thread in the fabric of the soul. We do not rush this work, we respect its depth. And in doing so we become the very presence we once waited for, the healing voice we thought would never come. It is in our own voice, in our own care, that the child finds home. May your words be steady and sincere, your presence soft and unwavering, and your heart open to the quiet miracles that unfold in gentleness. Thank you for walking this path with courage. Good luck on your journey inward. Your inner child is listening, and they are ready to be loved.